Cold War, a film franchise was released showing America at war with the evil empire, which was Russia. The film franchise was called Star Wars, and even if people hate war, it is always skillfully marketed to the public to unconsciously make them endorse it. The Cold War is over, but there are policymakers who are digging up an old issue, and Hollywood, the most influential voice of the US military-industrial complex, is producing a number of films to take you back to the Cold War era to bolster the US propaganda agenda of making the world hate Russia that would justify America economically or militarily to boycott Russian influence on the world stage. When the United States wants to turn a group into an enemy, she will use the enticing power of the media. US Secretary of State John Kerry called Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to try to hinder Russia from not supporting President Assad of Syria, for he says that is hindering the US from defeating ISIS. With the US and NATO member states doing training exercises and stationing forces surrounding Russia, a future showdown is highly likely. President Barack Obama has been accused of escalating these world crises in both Russia and in the Middle East, but he inherited these wars from his predecessor George W. Bush Jr. when he invaded Iraq in 2003 with a coalition of 20 nations. But his predecessor, Bill Clinton, was already bombing Iraq in 1998, laying the groundwork for his successor. But Clinton's predecessor, George Bush Sr., got the ball rolling with his invasion of Iraq in the 1990 to 1991 Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. But he, who was the 11th director of the CIA, also inherited the war policy of his predecessors, and US foreign policy has not changed in one iota since the end of the Second World War. But who single-handedly formulated the US war policy that all US presidents have followed? Avram Manhattan was one of the best investigative journalists of the 20th century. You don't get that level of skill today. He mentions a man called George F. Kennan, an American diplomat and historian who more or less shaped US Cold War foreign policy. Avram Manhattan said that in 1947, the Cold War was initiated. About 1948, a frightful American-Russian armament race began. Mr. George Kennan, designated as new US ambassador to Moscow, was the architect of the Truman-Axel containment policy, specifically designed against Soviet Russia, around which the whole American policy of Colossus rearmament was revolving. Expanding on Manhattan's legacy, American philosopher Noam Chomsky shows that George Kennan's war policy of invading and colonizing the entire planet for its natural resources was in place way before some of the previous presidents mentioned were even born. George Kennan, who headed the State Department planning staff until 1950, was one of the most intelligent and lucid of planners and a major figure in shaping the post-war world. During World War II, study groups of the State Department and Council on Foreign Relations developed plans for the post-war world in terms of what they called the Grand Era, which was to be subordinated to the needs of the American economy. The Grand Era was to include the West Hemisphere, Western Europe, the Far East, the former British Empire which was being dismantled, the incomparable energy resources of the Middle East, which were then passing into American hands as we pushed out our rivals France and Britain, the rest of the Third World, and, if possible, the entire globe. In a briefing for US ambassadors to Latin American countries in 1950, Kennan observed that a major concern of US foreign policy must be the protection of our Latin America's raw materials. Kennan even suggested that Europe might get a psychological lift from the project of exploiting Africa. Let us take a brief look at the war on terror's expansion from the Middle East into Africa.
Deterring and defeating transnational threats, preventing future conflicts, supporting humanitarian and disaster relief efforts, and protecting U.S. security interests. That's the mission of U.S. Africa Command. But it's a mission we can't do alone.
Do they have any other business partnerships other than the rare earth refinery?
So there are no issues here then?
We're prepared to offer a 40-year lease on the Meimei Rare Earth Elements refinery.
For appearances?
Yes, appearances.
We want our companies building those products right here in America. But to do that, American manufacturers need to have access to rare earth materials, which China supplies.
Sudan is now the epicenter of a collision between America and China.
When walking through the streets of central London, you see a number of protesters demonstrating against corporations that are exploiting Africa's natural resources, according to George Kennan's advice. Opposite British Prime Minister David Cameron's home, 10 Downing Street, Eritreans are demonstrating against the United States meddling in its internal affairs that has led to the depletion of the economy, and with job availability scarce, many flee in their thousands to seek work, and a document from an Arab army officer makes it clear that Eritrea and Yemen are geographically located in the Red Sea area, which is one of the top trading routes for the world's oil. The Democratic Republic of Congo has a culture where men show off their slick suits, but it is one of the most exploited countries on earth, being one of the highest producers of the world's diamonds. And when walking over London's Victoria Bridge, you will see the headquarters of British Secret Service MI6, and recent revelations have shown that they have played a key role in the exploitation of the Congo, according to George Kennan's plans. Patrice Lumumba, a tall, educated, well-dressed individual, was democratically elected to govern the Congo so that the natives of Congo will benefit from their own land. But in a number of months, he was overthrown, and guess why? According to the London Guardian newspaper, it reads that with the outbreak of the Cold War, it was inevitable that the US and its Western allies would not be prepared to let Africans have effective control over strategic raw materials, lest these fall into the hands of their enemies in the Soviet camp. It is in this regard that Patrice Lumumba's determination to achieve a genuine independence and to have full control over Congo's resources in order to utilize them to improve the living conditions of our people was perceived as a threat to Western interests. So the country with the highest rare earth elements will forever be exploited. But Somalians from a group called Al-Shabaab have been waging a number of attacks in their neighboring countries in East Africa. The attacks in the malls and in a high school were no more brutal than the drone attacks in Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Iraq, or Yemen by the United States. We usually look at the world through the eyes of the West, but in a magazine titled New African, June 2015 edition, Africans know full well why AFRICOM is in Africa, and it is not to defeat terrorism. The direct link between natural resources and conflict cannot be gainsaid. A 2011 UN Environmental Programme study estimated that the Democratic Republic of Congo's untapped mineral resources were worth $24 trillion. So far, Al-Shabaab's highly publicized July 2010 Kayadongo attacks in Uganda, which claimed 74 people, The Westgate Mall attack, where 28 non-Muslim passengers and 36 manual labourers were killed, together with the recent Garissa University attack and its 148 deaths, remain the key events informing the fast-paced emergence of terror in the East African region. It is significant to note, however, that the Garissa and Mandera attacks, which saw scores of non-Muslims leaving the region, occurred just after Africa Oil announced that it had discovered some 1.8 trillion cubic meters of gas in Wajir, which is in the middle of Garissa and Mandera. There is Uganda's 2006 oil find. Kenya, where Tula Oil struck oil in Turkana in 2012, which is expected to yield more than 1 billion barrels, complemented by 1.8 trillion cubic feet of gas in the Indian Ocean and northern parts of Kenya. Tanzania has, on the other hand, made significant offshore discoveries, which at the last count stood at 50 TCF. Mozambique, on the other hand, is said to have 150 TCF of gas. Africa's youngest state, South Sudan, has of late been racked by civil war, at the heart of which is the sharing of oil proceeds. So George F. Kennan's post-war plan that has been recently titled The War on Terror is not about defeating extremist groups, but to take by force the natural resources of Africa and the Middle East, and to eventually rob the freedoms of the civilians in the West. Now, this study is titled The Two Kingdoms, and no matter how far North America expands its territory, prophetically, it is eventually going to benefit an even older power. This is President Harry Truman in his Masonic regalia. You cannot reach those high levels in government without being a member of a secret society or being bought by the bankers. But during the Cold War, he strengthened an alliance with the papacy, whose head at that time was Pope Pius XII. Others in the US government, such as John Foster Dulles, the US Secretary of State, strengthened ties with the papacy. And the head of the Joint Chief of Staff, George Marshall, famous for that economic European recovery, the Marshall Plan. Pius XII's other strongest links in the United States of America was a man nicknamed the American Pope, Cardinal Francis Joseph Spellman, the Archbishop of New York, and the main link between the Vatican and the Pentagon. He was also the military bishop of the United States Armed Forces. But it was his liaison and his support for Emperor Diem that helped this Vietnamese into leadership that separated South Vietnam from the North, that eventually brought the military power of the United States into a war in Indochina, the Vietnam War, that was nicknamed in intelligence circles as Spellman's War. The United States still have men that are psychologically damaged from that senseless war. The Vatican comes out squeaky clean, but the United States gets constantly pounded and blasted for her involvement in Indochina, when both US soldiers and Vietnamese civilians are still suffering to this very day as a result of the US Army spraying a chemical over the whole of Vietnamese vegetation called Agent Orange, which was supplied by a company that is today trying to control the seed market, Monsanto. In an attempt to set up that Catholic satellite state in Southeast Asia to hinder the growth of communist China, the Buddhist population that made up about 80% of the population pleaded with Emperor Diem of the injustices that were being imposed upon the people by this newly installed brutal government. Some of these monks burnt themselves in protest at the harsh treatment they were experiencing, but they weren't the only ones who were to suffer. Avram Manhattan knew exactly who was also a target, and this is important to note for those who want to see what the future holds. Diem became determined to create a model Catholic state in Southeast Asia. For the church to be perfect, the state must be integrated with her so that the two become as one. Elements preventing such union therefore had to be eliminated. These meant the Protestants at that time, numbering about 50,000, mostly Baptists and Seventh-day Adventists. Diem had planned to eliminate them chiefly via legislation by prohibiting their missions, closing their schools, and refusing licenses to preach or have religious meetings. The present author at that time lived only a few yards from the embassy of South Vietnam in Victoria Road in Kensington, that is, in London. He called at the embassy a number of times to find out the reason for the Diem regime's harassing certain disruptive Buddhist sects. When the present author mentioned the Protestants, an official explained that they were a special case. Since they were Christians, their prosecution would be justified. A perfect Catholic state therefore could not tolerate Protestants nor Christians who did not believe in the uniqueness of the Catholic Church. To end the Cold War, the two kingdoms formed an even closer alliance than at the beginning of the Cold War, where the religious, economic, and intelligence apparatus worked stronger in unison to bring down Russia. The London Guardian of recent is clear that to strengthen this liaison, William Casey, the director of the CIA, used to fly to Rome regularly to brief the Pope on the fight against communism in Eastern Europe. And with the Vatican being the only power on earth that can bring US presidents on their knees, what's in store for the future?
As a final set of questions, I want to ask you a question. You are a practicing Catholic and you've gotten the Pope, first time ever, to come visit Congress. You've been working on that for a long time.
Yeah, about 20 years ago, I offered my first invitation to a Pope, and over the years, 3 different times I've attempted to get the Pope to come and address a joint session of Congress. We've never had a Pope come, and I'm really happy that the Pope has accepted my invitation. You know, for a kid who grew up going to Mass every morning, this is a pretty humbling experience.
On the eve of your historic trip to the United States and to Cuba, we have gathered people in 3 U.S. cities, Chicago.
Pope Francis I did a live link on ABC News to cities in the United States he would not be able to visit. It was not a coincidence that they were all from Latin America, like himself. And one of the biggest social issues in North America is immigration, with Hispanics making up the bulk of unregistered illegal immigrants. And any senator running for the Oval Office to become US President knows full well that it is political suicide to discriminate against the Hispanic community, who make up a vast bulk of the Roman Catholic vote. So the Pope used this platform via a live link. But what is his real objective of visiting the United States? We shall see.